Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to our channel if you're new here and turn on notifications so you don't miss a new video every single day. Here we go. Landlord tries to keep us in a mold house. We get his place condemned by the city. I've lived in a lot of awful places throughout my college years, but this was one of the big ones. I'd recently moved into a house with two other girls. It wasn't the best house, but seemed to look okay for a college apartment. One of the girls had a friend who had lived there before and told us that the landlord was sexist and kind of a jerk, but usually meant well and it was decent rent. I'll be referring to him as Dumb A Landlord. We were all broke, so we decided to sign a lease. I should have realized the warning signs when Dumb A Landlord wanted to sign it in a Big Boys, after he'd just eaten dinner there. And the leasing agreement looked like he chopped it up from other pictures of lease agreements on Google. We also found this apartment as an ad off of Craigslist. Things were fine for a few months. I was living alone until the next school year would start and wasn't home all the time since I would go over to my boyfriend's a lot and sleep over. It was a split house with an apartment in the basement, and ours was on the first floor. It wasn't long until I started to notice things happening. We'd get a good amount of rain since we're in the Midwest by some big local lakes and it was springtime. We'd get a good amount of water and the concrete steps to the house would consistently fill up with water I had to jump over. It'd disappear overnight. It also started to get a little bit of a musty smell in the house, and I'd started coughing and sneezing all the time but didn't know why. Soon the other girls moved in and we started having some difficulties with Dumb A Landlord. He wouldn't tell us when he came over to check on the property. He said he did this to keep up on looks and mow the lawn, but he did it way too often for any of us to be okay with it. He would argue with us about having a copy of our own lease. He'd yell at us to give him his rent payments in cash, especially before going to his cabin up north with his girlfriend. But the biggest of all was that we were having problems with mold, and he did not care. For a while, we hadn't talked to the people in the basement apartment until everyone started having problems with Dumb A Landlord. We hear them arguing and yelling down below about as often as we would upstairs. But they were in a hellhole. Everything they owned had mold growing on it. They had bugs everywhere, earwigs, beetles, ants, you name it. They were constantly throwing away their clothes, dishes, furniture, even their college papers and homework since it was all growing mold. They spent money on plastic bins to hold most of their important items, but even those would get moldy. We also found out they were supposed to have another roommate down below, but she couldn't live there with her allergies to mold after signing a lease agreement. We also found out that Dumb A Landlord verbally abused her and her mother on the phone to the point where they were crying and she couldn't get out of the lease. She ended up paying for 2 places every month so that she didn't have to live there because he wouldn't let her break her lease and didn't care. Upstairs wasn't as bad as the basement, but it wasn't good either. All of us were coughing more and more each month. We'd wake up coughing in the middle of the night, and we were getting really sick. We tried to air out the house as best we could, but nothing helped. I ended up getting a severe case of strep throat so bad that every swallow I took made my eyes water and made me verbally make noise from the pain. I tried to ask the doctor I went to if he could prove that this was mold later, but he unfortunately couldn't give me a solid statement on it. Me being a vocal, neutral good person, who was also going to school to be an architect, tried to explain to him what was going on in the house. No air circulation, his concrete steps and foundation walls were not sealed, so all of the water I'd have to jump over was most likely going into the basement walls, causing most all of the mold. We also found a few areas on the roof that needed patching since we noticed some leaks, among other things, and the basement apartment had cheap patio doors for their only means of entrance and exit, which would consistently be up against water when it rained, adding to the problem. Oh, smart, Dumb A Landlord decided that we were all just girls complaining about silly things that didn't mean anything, so he brushed us off and said we were fine, even though I had told him that I was learning about these things in school and knew what I was talking about. He wouldn't let us out of the lease, as hard as we tried, so all of us girls in both apartments decided we would get out if it was the last thing we did. Then we began researching all of the legal apartment and tenant information for our state and city to get out. We were paying for attorney fees, started taking pictures of the mold upstairs and downstairs that we could find, talking with several different city staff and police, and started compiling this into a nice document. After deferring my rent payments to get a copy of the lease agreement from Dumb A Landlord, we could finally take a look at our legal document and use that further to get out. We were also working with another landlord at a renting company in town, who I'll call Good A Landlord. He was thankfully doing his best to get us out of that crap hole and into his apartment. Through him, we'd get all of the legal ins and outs of the renting business, and he'd help us find a loophole. Then, after months and months of arguments, money, and research, we found it. If we sent in a mold test to a research lab and it was over the limit of what was inhabitable, we could get out. It was safe to say we had a pretty good idea that it was over the limit. The test came back a few days later, and we sent that off to the city, including our nice document of pictures, statements, and leasing agreements. Not even 4 hours went by, and we got a call from the city. Our house was so full of mold that we were to move out of the apartment within 24 hours, and it was to be condemned. We were ecstatic. All that hard work had finally paid off, although it was horrifying to know that the mold count was so high. The mold researcher who'd been in the business for more than 30 years had not once seen a place with higher mold count than this house. Yes, this included black mold. Fast forward to us happily packing up in our house, all of our parents getting us out together, and moving us into the apartment that Good A Landlord kept open for us to move into. And poor old Dumb A Landlord sobbing in our driveway as we happily stacked boxes into cars, complaining that he should have paid more attention and listened to us. This was his girlfriend's property, and she's going to dump him. We all took a picture the next day, smiling in front of the condemned signs. It's still one of my favorite pictures to this day. And our next story. Try to squeeze my dad for his money? Tough luck. He knows money. The background. Back during the 1997 Asian financial crisis, Malaysia was hit pretty hard, especially the small independent banks. The Prime Minister at the time passed a bill to save the banking economy by having all the larger corporate banks buy out the smaller independent banks. At the same time, he made the One Malaysia Home Loan Policy. Under this, all larger banks that bought out the smaller independent banks must send an acknowledgement letter to the home loaners of the original banks stating the home loan change and must receive an acknowledgement from the new loaners, be it a signature, physical, or digital. The story. My dad never liked how banks can legally rob people. For people like him who work the daily grind, having to pay the bank what is essentially 2 houses worth in interest payments over 2 or 3 decades is just plain wrong in his eyes. He strives to one day screw a bank over like how they screw their customers. A contract. Be it sheer dumb luck, or is God listening to his prayers and decided to grant him that opportunity? That was what he got. When my dad bought our family's first home, he got a loan from a small bank called DCB Bank. All is well until a few years later. The 1997 financial crisis hit. As the small banks were bought out by the larger banks, many homeowners received acknowledgement papers on their new home loan payment plan and policies by their new banks. My dad, for whatever reason, never received this. He only knew that his original bank was bought over by RHB Bank Corporation and that he is now unofficially their customer. My dad was frugal with his money and, God bless him, financially literate. He knew that if he made a full settlement against his principal loan, he could avoid paying 30 years' worth of interest installments. Sometime in 2007, he went to a RHB Bank branch nearby to make a full settlement, and this is how it went down. RHB employee: I'm sorry, sir. Even if you make a full settlement, you would still need to continue making payments for the interest. Dad: What do you mean? I have a home loan contract under DCB that states I can make a full settlement without paying for additional interest. RHB employer: True, but since you've acknowledged and signed under RHB... Dad: I've never received the acknowledgement papers. I never signed any papers from your bank. And all I have here is the DCB bank contract. RHB employer: Sir, under the One Malaysia Home Loan... Dad: You have to send acknowledgement letters about the loan transfer. Yes, I know. What I want now is for you, RHB Bank, to produce my signature of me acknowledging the new loan policy for RHB. As of now, my paper with DCB is still valid until you produce my signature. Cue 1 hour of the employer and her colleagues scrambling around their files and databases, trying to find any acknowledgement from my dad about their loan contract. At this time, the manager of the bank had called my dad into his office to discuss the problem. It basically had went from civil to a shouting match that can be heard in the neighboring food stalls. My dad couldn't remember most of what was said, but the end of it was what he could still clearly remember. And to his son, it was probably one hell of a badass conversation ender. Manager: I'm sorry, Mr. Muhammad, but you still need to make the interest payments regardless of whether you make a full payment. Dad: all right, I understand. I'll just have to take this up to Bank Negara, National Bank of Malaysia. Let them help you find that signature of mine. My dad had the bank manager by the balls now. Rather than risking a potential $1 million lawsuit and possibly losing his job, he excused himself to make a few phone calls to upper management, which took about half an hour. After said phone calls were done, the manager approached my dad and agreed to the full settlement without the additional interest installments. To add salt to the wound, my dad requested that they have his housing grant ready within the week, to which they delivered. All in all, my dad managed to secure himself a house, the housing grant, and in the process, screwed RHB Bank of what is equal to $60,000 worth of interest payments, which to a middle-class Malaysian in 2007 is a retirement fund. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video, and I'll see you in the next one.